Welcome to all of you from FENRO. I'm Lara Fedorchenko. I'm working as a policy advisor for FENRO, and I'm responsible for everything surrounding education for sustainable development and global learning at FENRO. I'm very happy that so many of you have joined us today. And 2 days ago, the UNESCO World Conference ended, and with its new program, ESD for 2030, UNESCO stresses once again the importance of education on our way to transform our societies and economies in order to reach a sustainable future, ecologically, economically, and last but definitely not least, socially. The program they posted is quite ambitious, and it definitely has to be quite ambitious because it has a very tight time frame in line with Agenda 2030 to be realized until 2030. The program claims a key role of education in realizing the SDGs, and it calls out an urgently needed decade of action. But more important than this program, which has just been written on a paper, is exactly the action that follows. So how are the recommendations of the new program picked up by the people in power, and what do UNESCO member states plan to implement the new program in their national contexts? Today, we want to take a closer look at exactly those questions and start to translate the UNESCO program from theory into practice and put in the civil society perspective in this process. And I am very happy to have Monika Döge here today. Monika is one of the directors of the One World Net North Rhine-Westphalia, which is here in Germany. She is an expert on German and European processes of education for sustainable development, global learning, and global citizenship education, and she will guide us through this meeting today. I will now hand over to you, Monika. Thanks for being here with us.
Thank you very much, Lara, and a good afternoon and a very warm welcome from my side as well. So I was with all of you, or many of you, in the last workshop, and I'm very happy and was looking forward to being with you today as well. And I find it very exciting, so the process that we're having on UNESCO level at the moment. And yesterday evening, I went through the EU actions for ESD for 2030, and that is where we I'm going to have a look this afternoon and on the role of civil society and the global perspectives. And I'm so glad that so many are with us. We are 39 participants now from 80 registered. So there is still some potential with regard to our participants that may join later. So as we talked about a little bit, exciting days of the conference lie behind of many of you, and also tiring days since it's all digital and not online due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And I hope you're getting through the pandemic and these days of crisis quite well. And I'm looking forward to have this possibility and opportunity to sharing and learning together this afternoon. So we will have a look at the ESD for 2030 and look how the program is going to be implemented and put into practice in many of the member states. So we will have a look at the conference, and our distinguished guests will share their views of the results and the outcomes from their different perspectives. And I hope many of you will join. And Lara has already switched to the agenda. So we are in the phase of welcoming the speakers and the participants, give the technical advice. So we will have reports from the UNESCO World Conference from Natalya and Werner, whom I'm going to introduce a little bit later in more detail. That will start at 10 to 3. Then we will have an open round of questions and answers, of course. And then we will go to the introduction of the civil society shadow reports. But getting back to the reports, maybe that is good to announce it already. So we will have Natalya and Werner to share really their impressions with us, but we are looking very much forward if more of you could do that and share their experience and prepare maybe a little bit to think about what you would like to share with us later on. Yeah, after the introduction of the civil society shadow reports, we will have another round of Q&A. And then, of course, the closing remarks and some evaluation with the Mentimeter. And we will start with the Mentimeter now as well. But before we do that, I would just like to share two remarks with you. So on the one hand, I would like to really encourage you. We are holding this conference in English, and we have participants from all over the world. But I know that many for whom it's not the native language are quite shy to speak, but I would really like to encourage you. So all of us who are not native speakers will be in the situation that they're lacking a word, and I'm sure we will help each other out. So it's very nice really having a debate, a vivid debate here on the screen as well. But feel free to put your questions and your remarks and comments into the chat, and Lara will have an eye on the chat and share this with us. So that is also a possibility to participate. So I'm just flicking through my notes, whether I've forgotten anything. I don't think so. So looking forward to our Mentimeter sharing, where we come from, etc. And I'm handing over to Lara.
Thank you, Monica. So in fact, we are using Slido today, which is pretty much the same as Mentimeter, an online polling tool. No problem. I will share my screen with you in a second. And the first question you should see now is I work for, and then there's 3 answer possibilities, or 4, an NGO, an educational institution, and a state institution. So first, people have already found the function. I see some answers. We have a lot of people who work for NGOs, apparently. There's definitely someone who works for an educational institution, also someone for a state institution.
More from state institutions, actually. But really, the overwhelming majority works with NGOs.
Which is probably not that surprising, given our field of action. I will start now the second question, which asks you in which region you work. So where are you sitting right now in front of your computer? Most of the people working in Europe right now, all of them who have answered, but I know that there's people from other continents who are part of this seminar as well today.
Now we have a slightly different picture. 4%.
You're missing Central America there.
Yeah, where is South America?
Oh, right.
Hey, what is that?
I'm so sorry. That's my mistake, definitely. Okay. So let's get to the third question, which asks you if you participated in the UNESCO World Conference the last day. So we get a feeling of how many from you probably will join us in the Q&A session and report from their experiences during the UNESCO conference.
So it would be interesting to know that in numbers now and not in percent. So maybe some of you could write into the chat that we know who is actually there. So I have the list here prepared, of course, but that is not that reliable at the moment now, since we are 44 and not 80 participants. But there should be like 12 or 15 who have participated in the conference, if my calculation is right. All right.
Okay, thank you for participating in the Slido. I guess we have a little better overview about who's in the room with us today. I hope we will see a lot of you during our interactive Q&A sessions. And yeah, back to Monica. By that, I will stop to share my screen now.
Thank you very much, Lara. And thank you, Daniela, who wrote in the chat that there are 16 people who have participated in the UNESCO conference. So we know that already. So please be prepared for our debate later on. And I'd like to welcome Natalya Kohar again very warmly. Great that you are here with us today, Natalya. You're the project manager at the NGO Support Center, that is a non-governmental organization to the development and strengthening of civil society in Cyprus. And you are also the national officer for Bridge 47 and working on advocacy at EU and global levels. And I think many of us know that Bridge 47 is a global network created to mobilize and empower societies to do their part for global justice, to contribute to the eradication of poverty and to a more sustainable future for all. And this through making SDG target 4.7 a reality. That is like the presupposition that we are all building on. And Natalya, you participated in the UNESCO conference and will share your experience with us here. So we would like to know in particular how the outcome can be assessed by a civil society perspective. That is your perspective now that you will share with us. And how civil society actors have been considered during the conference and also concerning the follow-up process, like the country initiatives. And how can civil society keep a strong voice, in your opinion, within the process of the implementation of ESD for 2030? So the floor is yours.
Thank you so very much. Good afternoon, good evening to everyone from Cyprus. My name is Natalya Kohar, as Monica mentioned. I work at the NGO Support Center here in Cyprus, but I am also the advocacy officer for Bridge 47. I took part in the conference as part of my national delegation representing a civil society organization. Just want to share a little bit of my thoughts and input on how the conference went from a civil society perspective, and looking forward to have the discussions afterwards with all of you. Okay, just a little bit about Bridge 47. So Bridge 47, as mentioned by Monica, is a global network. It was created to bring people together to share and learn from each other, but also to help make Target 4.7 of the SDGs a reality. We mobilize and empower societies and people to do their part for a more sustainable future for all of us. And so for us, this conference was a very important process to hear a little bit more about the vision for ESD. We're very happy to be able to have these conversations about how we make that vision a reality from a civil society standpoint. Bridge 47 is a global network, but it's also in the context, it's also a project that's an EU-funded project that includes a consortium of many different organizations from across Europe, NGO Support Center being one. So diving into the World Conference a little bit, and my perspective on how civil society actors were being considered during the conference. So first of all, it's a matter of representation a little bit. So from how I felt or experienced the conference, there was a strong civil society representation in panels, or quite a healthy one, and more strongly in the SDG marketplace, which was a space that had different virtual booths that were offered to be able to present the work that CSOs do across the globe around ESD, and also offer some good practices and present activities and programs. So the marketplace beyond the booths had also live sessions where in the middle of the different panel discussions were available for participants to take part in, so that was an opportunity, even more than the panel discussions, to have close contact and hear the work that's been done by civil society organizations, as well as other stakeholders around ESD globally. More specifically, I'd highlight session number 6, which is testimonies of transformative action for the ESDGs, and the session about empowering and mobilizing youth. So these were the two sessions where I felt that there was a lot more discussion about civil society contributions there. There were other areas, other sessions where civil society was mentioned and practices from civil society were mentioned, but those were the two sessions where I felt that there was a lot more to be said. There was a referencing during, obviously, the entire conference about the multi and cross-sectoral approach of the roadmap for ESD, and strong focus on recommendations for partnership with civil society came from two sessions that I could recognize. Session 1, there was a presentation on the report called Learned for Our Environment, which is a global review how the environmental issues are integrated in education. There was an area there from the speakers where they would actually have a strong recommendation for civil society to be in partnership with other stakeholders to achieve ESD. And then a quite interesting session for me was session 12, which was called Putting ESD into Action, ESD in Lifelong Learning. It was very interesting to follow that discussion. And there was interesting conversations about capacity building for teachers and educators, localizing action for ESD, and creating resources. And all that was strongly focused on the lens of, let's see how we can collaborate with other stakeholders, civil society included, for some of these areas within the 5 pillars of the roadmap. So in terms of how civil society actors were considering the conference, there were the ministerial statements where ministries from across the world, from the member states, explained how they would mainstream ESD, or what the vision was in terms of the state level work for ESD and pushing for SDGs forward. There were a few explicit references to cooperation with civil society from some of these within these ministerial statements. So not that much of a focus on other stakeholders' collaboration, but mostly within the ministry's work. And also, obviously, in the closing remarks of the conference, there was a connection made between how do we support the work done in schools, policy, and community level, and that there was a highlight there for civil society perspective being taken into account. And of course, the Berlin Declaration being the text that was adopted at the closing of the conference. And there, of course, there's this highlight of an importance for cross-sectoral partnerships, and civil society is included in that aspect. So this is a little bit about how I perceive the participation or the presence of civil society in the conference. Now, in terms of the outcome of the conference, for me, the first and foremost is the Berlin Declaration being adopted. And there are 2 processes there. One is the consultation process, even before the conference. It's worth mentioning, I think. So there were 2 processes that UNESCO initiated: the collective consultation for CSOs and other ESD stakeholders, and then the UNESCO consultation for member states to draft and prepare the declaration and offer it to us as participants in the conference to see and go over and offer our remarks. As Bridge 47, we took part in both consultations. So we were invited as Bridge 47 to offer some feedback, both in us from the CSO perspective and from some of the member states of our consortium organizations. We were also invited there. And UNESCO did encourage member states to include CSOs and other stakeholders in their delegations in this process, which was very, very fruitful and very positive. It opened the door for us to express our interest and be involved. Now, the adoption at the end of the World Conference, obviously there's an acknowledgement of civil society at the forefront of the declaration, of the preamble of the declaration. The declaration itself just places ESD, anchors it within Target 4.7 and clarifies that it's a foundation for holistic transformational learning for a sustainable future, which is important to us. The declaration clarifies that should integrate ESD in all levels of education, learning, and training, and specifically adult education is also mentioned, as well as non-formal and informal learning. And so the lifelong and life-wide perspective for us is highly important. Now, our feedback as Bridge 47 on 4.7 and lifelong and life-wide learning was taken on board during the drafting of the declaration, but we would have preferred to see also a stronger recognition of global citizenship at the finalization of this text, which was not there, we feel. But there is an emphasis on the actual declaration on the importance of multi-sectoral and multidisciplinary collaboration, which is important to us because it's that open door for civil society to be included in action. Just in the follow-up process, leaving the outcome, the Berlin Declaration on the side and looking at the follow-up process. Now, how would civil society actors could be considered in the processes? Where is room for work and collaboration? So the ministerial statements, there was a commitment to mainstreaming ESD. There was a large commitment from across all member states and an aligning curricula with the SDGs. There was a few references, as I mentioned before, to cooperation with civil society. So there's a lot of room there for work to be done to be able to achieve that cross-sectoral collaboration and the multi-sectoral collaboration that the declaration and the roadmap envision. And obviously the country initiatives, which is the other process that's being initiated by UNESCO, is what is interesting to us as civil society. According to the country initiatives template that was offered during the conference, and it's available to member states to fill in, all member states are invited to mobilize all concerned stakeholders working in the 5 different priority areas of the roadmap to support this networking and create a coordinated strategy related to the national frameworks on the SDGs. So ministries of education are identified as the leading bodies for these initiatives within the actual template of the country initiatives, but it's encouraged that they will create a working group. They will form a working group that would include multiple stakeholders that are working across the 5 priority areas, and CSO, civil society, is explicitly mentioned and encouraged to be part of these working groups, and that's the space for us. How can we have a strong voice? How can we have an active participation in action moving forward as civil society? The country initiatives, so being included in the working groups of member states, being actively involved and contributing in the processes. The country initiatives also encourage the mapping out of initiatives and activities and events that are happening around the 5 priority areas. And so there is space there for civil society to offer a lot in this mapping of initiatives, because a lot is happening from civil society on ESD as well. So there should be a recognition and inclusion of all the activities at all levels of learning and all formats of learning, formal, not only formal, which seems to be more highlighted, but also non-formal and informal, and through a lifelong and life-wide lens. And also the country initiatives highlight the importance of monitoring and evaluating ESD processes at country level, and there's also there, I feel, space for civil society to contribute in collecting data for monitoring how we're doing on that front. And just there's going to be also, closing with the World Conference, there's going to be some upcoming regional conversations on ESD for 2030 that will be happening in the different regions. There will be 5 events happening from the 25th of May until the 9th of June, where UNESCO member states are going to be kind of discussing how do we create these working groups and these networks of actors coming together to make the roadmap a reality. And so there's space there for civil society as well to be involved in these conversations, as we move forward. And some milestones, of course, ahead. So the COP15 and COP26 would be spaces where civil society most definitely should be involved as well. But I guess we should see beyond that, and this event here is a great opportunity for us to discuss what else can be done for civil society to be actively involved. And so I thank you very much for your attention, and looking forward to the conversations.
Thank you very much, Natalya, for this comprehensive presentation and for your insights. So this will be something that we are going to be very alert on, like our seminar is called From Theory to Practice. So this is the theory, so to say, and we will now be very interested in how this is put into practice. And of course, we all have our experiences from the past. And like you said, there are the initiatives and many of them that are being mapped. And that is something that we will focus on in our exchange later on. So thank you very much again. We would move swiftly to our next speaker, Werner Munoz from the Global Campaign for Education, where Werner works as head of policy, advocacy, and campaigns in Costa Rica. Hello, Werner. Very welcome to the conference, and wonderful that you are here with us. Werner, you have been working with Plan International, among others, and as a consultant for UNESCO, for UNICEF, and other international organizations. You also have a very broad academic background with degrees in literature, in law, in human rights, in philosophy, and you have a PhD in education. And you were the former UN Special Rapporteur on the right to education from 2004 to 2010. So we are honored that we have you here with us today. And our questions to you are, how's the outcome of the UNESCO conference assessed from a global perspective? If we may ask you to, with your perspective, give the global perspective, maybe it's a little bit broad, but that is the direction of our question. Then how are we going to manage to realize ESD for 2030 globally, given the reality that we are having very different starting points in the different countries? And how can we strengthen the international cooperation in the coming debate? That is a question also like sort of overarching to we will deepen our debate on that in our next seminar, but we will begin right here today. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, dear Monica. Thank you also, Lara, and thank you very much to Venro and to partners who organized this very interesting and very useful conference. I very much celebrate that you are opening the space for civil society debate on the outcomes of this important conference. So yes, I will try to address these three questions as you requested. So the first one is about the outcome of the UNESCO conference from the global perspective. And I think that the conference provided a huge range of very relevant issues and very rich discussions on very sensitive themes related to sustainability. And let me just mention some of the program issues for those who didn't have the chance to attend the conference. So they raise climate change and biodiversity, green and circular economies, resilient relationships through education, transformative education, technology for a sustainable world, building capacities in educators, youth empowerment, local level actions, and sharing good practices. But obviously a focus on the life cycle and education was there, including early childhood education and lifelong learning that were very much considered. And also addressing these five priority areas that Natalya just mentioned. You know, my feeling is that all these elements are built up in the SDG agenda and clearly resonate in the SDG 4. However, the level of engagement from the policy and political perspective varies a lot. And as always happened, the most critical perspectives came from the civil society sector as well as from the academic sector, which actually had a very little space to participate. And governments tends to be rhetorical and in many cases conservative, and they usually run from the legal binding obligations, which is not the case of all governments, by the way, but most of them. Then I think that some critical issues and overarching discussions are frequently missed from this type of conferences. And this possible missing agenda sometimes ignores colonization, patriarchal structures, global financing architecture, wild neoliberalism, power imbalance, and unfair trade, among others. For instance, a radical transformation of mindsets, as proposed by the declaration, requires a radical transformation of economic settings, which is the fundamental background of the change we need. And having said that, I'll try to comment on the second question that Monica placed.
That was how do we manage to realize ESD for 2030 given the different realities the different starting points in the different contexts and countries.
Exactly. So while thinking on this question, I recall the very famous book by Eric Fromm called The Sane Society. You may remember this very famous book. So this book mentions modern life as a kind of pathological normality, no? So, well, with COVID-19, we might be entering an extra pathological new normality, I would say. But I mean, the outcome of the so-called development at the standard for modern life has aggravated the pollution, the environment destruction, and the quality of life in general. So just notice that there are not an international binding legal instrument setting a common understanding of what development means. Is it greater access to technology, goods and services, for instance? Is it better salaries? Is it good living in peace with Mother Earth? Is it all this together plus the fancy term sustainable attached to it? And what is the role of education in all this? So after these days, I believe the conference helped us to clarify these questions. And at some stage, development, I think, is like a drug, and societies are like addicts looking for instant satisfaction that may rather destroy us. Because if the whole world seeks the industrial northern development standard, well, human life would end in a week. No? So I like Stefania Giannini saying that, and I quote, people learn is truly relevant to their lives, and what they learn helps to ensure the survival of our planet. That is actually one of the aims of education, as stated in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Article 29, and in many other human rights instruments. So this change can only happen if we take human rights as a way of life. So for me, is the meaning of true sustainable development. That is the very meaning, I say. Living, realizing, building, protecting, and securing human rights for all. So the development agenda places education in the space of services and governance, and not in the space of enforceability, obligation, and rights. Then I think that we have to move development and we have to move education to the human rights agenda in order to get a more consistent and systematic approach and to really make them sustainable. So following Mrs. Giannini's statement, I think that what is taught and what is learned is as important as how we teach and how we learn. So I agree we should address the content of education and the revolutionary potential of education, for tenderness, for peace, for human rights. And I strongly believe that education should return to its ends. So it's against reductionism and instrumentalization for the market. Of course, the idea of big transformation implies changes in individual actions, which is intertwined with the reorganization of societal structures. But this can only happen when we question the framework of exclusion and discrimination, which is characterized by a patriarchal ideology deeply embedded in the education systems. So I feel that transformation of learning environments require the full realization of the right to education. I mean, a transformative education can't just happen if countries do not have the resources they need to provide education to people with disabilities, or to train teachers, or build schools, or provide meals. So a comprehensive approach of the rights to and through education is needed for considering sustainable responses. and this entails providing funding to free, quality, inclusive public education systems. So here I will try to comment on the last question, which is how can we strengthen international cooperation in the coming decade? So let's start by saying that cooperation is a key obligation of the international community. But I also need to stress that education financing is a key obligation of states, because 97% of the resources needed for education should come from governments. So education financing is also a matter of sovereignty, justice, and democracy. Unfortunately, education financing is still far to reach the international standards, and this is the case of international cooperation for education, and especially in the context of emergencies. And by the way, we're still waiting a response to the attack to Palestinian schools, for instance. So one of the consequences of this is the prevalence of school fees and the privatization of education. So the increasing privatization of education is a global phenomenon that, although it has affected fragile and low-income countries, has spread more strongly in industrialized countries, and is possibly trying to reproduce itself as a role model, as is often the case of the neo-colonial practices. So instead of pushing for stronger public education systems, we see how some governments welcome private initiatives as a way to transfer their obligations to unaccountable actors. So the weakening of public systems is also a consequence of extremely low tax cultures. So tax justice is an urgent thing to deal with. And I think that private sector should contribute building an enabling and sustainable environment. But private sector should not lead the education governance, which is clearly a state central obligation. So the participation of big corporates in national and international policy spaces on education should depend on companies having a reputation for solidarity, transparency, and reciprocity. And paying fair taxes where they make profits is perhaps the most critical indicator of this. So we should stress that the crisis in education financing arises in part from the aggressive tax avoidance by the richest companies that have left public budgets stripped of resources to fund quality public education. So I think that these difficulties and these difficult times offer a unique opportunity for all to review the current privatization and utilitarian trends of education and strengthen the public education systems so education remain as an enabling right, not only responding to the employer's needs, but to the development of respect for human dignity. And I really think that civil society organizations should really question these very sensitive issues and should have a word in the decision making, starting with the very definition of what do we understand by civil society organizations, because many of the so-called philanthropists and foundations from the big corporates and also the building sector sometimes call themselves a civil society, which is very odd from our view. So these are my very first impressions, and obviously I am open to your comments and questions that you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Werner. Thank you very much for linking the ESD to questions of global justice. And the necessity to resist the neoliberal approaches that many of us are facing around the world. Like you mentioned, the realities of the privatization and the strong tendency of privatization of the educational sector, which actually should be public and open for all and not depending on the money that the family owns, and the tendency of companies avoiding taxes, and the question of tax justice and human rights, where this is linked to so strongly, and also reminding us of the critical voice, the necessity of the critical voice of the civil society organizations, and also questioning who is joining there sometimes. And I would just like to remind all of us that, for instance, the Council of Europe really avoids getting taxes from the huge communication companies that we all know. And that is really a political decision. And that is something that we also need to have an eye on. So thank you very much for bringing up all these issues that actually call for revolution in this sector. And I'd like to open the floor now to the round of other participants in the UNESCO conference. Like we said before, there have been so many of you participating in the conference, and we would like to invite you now to join this round and share your experiences and your impressions. And we have already one hand rising, and that is Gavami. So please, Mr. Gowami, go ahead.
Many thanks to our friend, Mr. Munoz. You know the German education system and its weakness very well, as you had been visited, I think, more than 10 years ago, Germany as a special rapporteur. And we from the World University Service had the opportunity to talk to you. And at that time, we presented you our views that there's really a big gap in the theory and the statements of the government and the practice here in Germany as well, which is more or less also the same situation in many parts of this world. As you know, WUS is also a member of the Global Education Partnership here in Germany, and we have been a strong supporter of the increasing education funding for the Global Education Partnership. And it was really funny that just in time for the final round of the conference on Wednesday, the German Minister for Development Cooperation announced that he will provide around 100 million euros for the Global Education Partnership over the next 4 years, and pledged this to our good friend Julia Gillard, chair of the Global Education Partnership. I think to achieve the education equality, we must use our lobbying efforts at the upcoming Global Education Summit in July. This means in more or less 1.5 months to go. Millions of children in countries of the global south, and especially girls and children from low-income families, are at risk of never attending schools again. And if we have been listening to the reports on Monday and until Wednesday, there have been many statements, even from governmental representatives, ministers and vice ministers, mentioning the really very, very sad situation created by this pandemic. But this is not a reason of the pandemic that many of them can't go to school. It's a long story back many, many years. And all the efforts that we have to put in is to lobbying that on this summit in July, all these states are pledging the necessary funds, because this situation is alarming, and we can't discuss theory approaches for curriculums and so on if the basic funding is missing. So our first really point as the outcome of the conference has to be that education in most part of this world is underfunding, and we have to increase the fundings, and we have to lobby that the member states have to increase their commitments. And this is one of the main roles of civil society organizations. And secondly, for me, one of the outcomes is we have to go to all these commitments of all these states and to look what is the reality in those countries and how we can achieve that these governments' commitments come to reality. And we have to monitor this. And for this monitoring work, we have to work very closely with all our colleagues around the world. And therefore, I think there would be a good chance to think how we can work more closely together with the colleagues from the Global Education Partnership. And I think you, Mr. Munoz, can be a good bridge for all the NGOs who are not at this moment members of this global education campaign, and that we can think how we can organize such kind of cooperation in a better way that we have done it in the past. Maybe these 2 points, it's enough for a further discussion, but I think these are the main outcomes which I can share with you.
Thank you, Mr. Gavani, for this very concrete suggestion to really join within the lobby, the lobbying and the advocacy to increase the member states' contributions for the partnership in education worldwide, and to lobby the summit in July, but also to cooperate more closely with the Global Campaign for Education. So we will keep note on this and look how we can realize it after our seminar, and take up this issue also in June in the next seminar, I think.
Jumping on what Mr. Gowami said?
Yes, of course. Please, Werner, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Mr. Gowami, sorry, for your great comments. I very much agree, and I thank you for your words. But just wanted to add that if we think that most of the money should come from the domestic resources, it's absolutely crucial addressing tax justice. And what we have seen is that GPE don't want to address tax justice as a key element of the current discussion. I heard that it was the World Bank who just banned GPE to addressing this. I mean, this is just rumors. I cannot assure anything. But the fact is that they are not talking about tax justice. So I don't know how can this be happening when education financing is clearly an issue here, as well as debt cancellation and debt alleviation. So we should address these things. I believe that a part of the sensitive cooperation coming from the industrialized countries and donor countries should include debt cancellation and debt alleviation as a way to move forward. So this should be also included in the lobby that we need to do. The Global Campaign for Education will be in the Financing Summit in July, and we are trying to organize some side events in order to address this kind of issues. But thank you for your remarks.
Thank you, Bernard. So that will be a possibility to join within the advocacy issues. And I think the global education and global citizen education and global learning practitioners should move a little bit more like to these really serious political issues like the one of the tax justice. So we need to sort of broaden our agenda. We have another 2 people who want to join into the debate. And that is Shaidul. And again, Mr. Gavani, I'm not sure whether it is an old or a new hand, but please, the 2 of you in this order.
First of all, let me be frank that I could not join the UNESCO conference last time, but I wanted to react on Mr. Gavani's point, particularly on monitoring. And in a country like Bangladesh, monitoring is a big question. And you need the engagement of civil society organization for that. But the reality in Bangladesh is that for last few years, all funding from development partners in education are mainly going to the government. and Bangladesh civil society organizations are suffering from that lack of funding to monitor the education funding in Bangladesh. And what happened that when it is going to the government side, that most of the funding are spent in infrastructure without having that much focus on quality of education. Big development partner like European Union or World Bank, they should rethink about that funding, whether they will strengthen or capacitate civil society organization to monitoring this financing of education within the country, as well as to whether the CSO will get enough space to share their experience so far on how to improve the quality of education. That was my first point. My second point is in reference to the COVID situation. And this COVID situation in the world has once again exposed the fact of discrimination. In a sense that, there's first of all, there's worldwide vaccination discrimination that developing countries are not getting that much vaccines. So our reopening of schools are getting late and late again. And I would say this temporary solution of online schooling, these children from poor families and children from the rural areas are not getting this opportunity to engage themselves in online education. So how to deal with this, with the new normal or the new difficulties that has appeared in front of us. So I would love to have some reflection from Mr. Munoz on that. Thank you very much.
Mr. Gavani, would you go ahead, please?
Yes, thank you. I would like to give Mr. Munoz, I appreciate your comment that we have to lobby not only for the finances as well as for the fact that education must not be privatized, which is in many part of the world already privatized. Education is one of the core tasks of any government. And therefore, my proposal is to work closely with the Global Campaign for Education and the national NGO umbrella organization like FENRO and others. And we have to have the close cooperation also with the labor organizations all over the world. Because only if we can work together, we will have an influence of these governmental approaches and World Bank approaches, which still are focusing on privatization of education. And this is something which can't be the key for a further development of the education sector in the future. Therefore, we have to have a clear vision what we want to achieve. And for me, this is a clear commitment for financing out of state budgets domestically, but also on the international level, but financing not for the privatization, but for the education as a human right. And therefore, this is a key governmental task and obligation of all the governments. And therefore, Mr. Munoz is absolutely right in his comment that financing is one side of the medal, but the other side is also to make it very clear that education can't be privatized, which some of the member states during the conference from Monday to Wednesday have sometimes mentioned that they are still want to have education more in private hands than under the responsibility for running the education sector by the governments. Governments sometimes only want to give the framework. For one example, in Vietnam, as you know, Vietnam is still a socialist country run by a communist party, which has been achieved a lot of positive results during the last 25 years when they started the so-called Doi Moi philosophy in Vietnam. But nevertheless, since they have been changing from a planned economy to a free open market economy, you have to pay school fees, you have to pay university fees, which has not been the case in Vietnam 25 years ago. when they have been a so-called planned economic country. And nowadays, they believe that the market can organize everything and the market will give everybody equal opportunity. But the reality in Vietnam is that children from poorer families can't afford to go to universities. They can't afford to finish their schools because the parents have not enough money to pay the fees. Although the government is providing some scholarships, but this is not enough. And this is only one example how a so-called socialist country believes in market economy, which is absolutely not the right way to do it.
Absolutely. So that reminds us of the need that we really need to resist these neoliberal politics and fight for the common good and broaden our political demands as an education practitioners community. So we have the question of Mr. Shaidul now, and after that we go to Martin Hagemeyer. Lara, could you please share the question with us?
Yes, so I think I put it in the wrong order. I think the first comment of Mr. Shahidul was that a lot of the funding goes into establishing education infrastructures, but the quality of education is often left behind. How can we make sure that funding is also spent for increasing the quality of the education? And then the second question was concerning the recent times of Corona, which worked as a catalyst for digital education. However, a lot of children from especially poor and rural communities are left out of the picture as they don't have any access to computers. How can we cope with that to make sure that the inequalities are not increasing here?
Yeah, the digital gap that is deepening.
And Mr. Shahidul just added that the question about quality in education is not only about funding, but also how to support CSO in ensuring the monitoring of the quality of their education.
So thank you very much, Mr. Shahidul, for your very relevant question and comments. And thank you, Lara, for write it down in the chat box. I'm sorry I missed the question. Yes, I think it's absolutely relevant. I think that the COVID-19 just revealed the asymmetries and the discrimination that were there before the pandemic. So it is, I mean, certainly the Corona helped us, if I may say that, to really see which concrete people are left behind and were put aside even before the pandemic. So I would say that now we clearly understand that if we don't take the right measures in order to address discrimination and exclusion, the situation would remain the same. So this is the kind of positive side of the Corona. I mean, if there is something positive, but I would say that, yeah, having the clear picture of who are the discriminated against people is absolutely key. And obviously, children would need to be the first to have a response, but not only children. And in terms of education, for instance, we know that the adult population is the biggest part of the discriminated people in terms of education opportunities. So this lifelong approach is more important now than ever in order to really understand where the needs are and what kind of priorities government should set. And I am absolutely with you on the fact that you mentioned that funding should not be only used for education infrastructure. Actually, the Global Campaign for Education really thinks that funding for education has to do with four elements. The first one is the share of the budget. The second one is the size of the budget. I mean, education should have a good part of the budget in order to guarantee at least 20% of the national spending for education. So size and share is important, but it is also important the sensitivity of the budget. I mean, money should go to the people most in need. I'm talking about rural communities, for instance. I'm talking about children with disabilities and persons with disabilities in general. So the sensitive of the budget should really respond to the needs and to the rights of these people. And then the fourth element is the scrutiny of the budget. We really think that civil society organizations should have the opportunity to call governments accountable on the spending, and should have the information that this process requires. So I think that, scrutiny of the budget is one fundamental right that civil society organizations have in order to monitor and to track education financing.
Thank you, Vernon. Now we're coming to Martin Hagemeyer, and then we have some questions in the chat. And I would just like to say that we are already in the general debate, so we don't need to stick to our schedule. Everyone is invited to participate, of course, and share their general opinions as well as the experiences from the conference. And I would ask Lara now, because there was one question from the colleague from Nigeria.
So the first one was about how corruption in governance is a hindering factor when we try to ensure adequate education funding in many countries in the global south, and what kind of global policy can help here to ensure ESD implementation in those nations. And is such enforcement even necessary in the first place? That's the first question. Maybe we'll stick to that.
I just wanted to have offer my input in what has been discussed so far, if it's possible as well. I want to say that I completely agree with what has been said in terms of the role and the support that civil society can offer. But I just want to make two remarks. I feel that a lot of times there's a tendency to feel that civil society has a policing role or a counteracting role from governments and governmental institutions, but that's not the case. The role of civil society should not be to be opposing and standing on the opposite side of government institutions, of ministries that are, but should be a more collaborative. It should be a more of a relationship that's collaborative and supportive. And so I think we could also kind of start thinking about how civil society can stand not in a policing manner towards governments or putting pressure towards governments necessarily, which is important. There's an advocacy role there to be held, but it's also important to see in what ways can we become collaborators towards improving the quality of education. So that's one input that I would like to make, because for civil society it's important to understand as well where our role stands, not just in terms of putting pressure to governments, but also in terms of how we can collaborate moving forward and discussing the way we can help monitor funding, for example. It's interesting, but we could also try to look at the perspective of where are the areas where we can collaborate, where are the possibilities for collaboration. And the other aspect that I would like to raise is when we talk about education, obviously we should be talking about education that, as Mr. Munoz referenced, lifelong education. And I think it's important to have in mind that where we're discussing evaluating, financing, all those aspects of education, we should be talking about everybody across their lifespan. And learning is not only happening in schools, it happens in other formats, and we should be constantly aware of the fact that when we talk about improving the quality of education, we should be talking about learning and education in all formats and across the board. It should be lifelong, it should be life-wide, it should be life-deep, and we should be supporting education that doesn't always only offer cognitive skills or the basic skills. It should also be education that offers other types of skills and value-based education that is not necessarily top priority at all times. These are the two key elements I want to just put there on the table in terms of the discussion.
Thank you very much, Natalya. And that reminds us all of the role of non-formal and informal education, of course, with which we can have some impact in society as well, with regard to these democratic and advocacy processes as well. Lara, do we have the other questions from the chat ready, or is Martin?
Martin is back and he seems to be ready to join the discussion. So probably we'll take him first, and then I will ask Oyigoga to pose his question, because I think he has already written it in the chat.
Wonderful. So Martin, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'm going to fix my microphone soon. I can always say thank you to all your contributions, especially to Mr. Munoz and Mr. Gavani. I appreciate a lot of what you said. I think it's brilliant content. I can be very glad being part of the German Youth Panel on ESD that is working on an institutionalized level. And this is funded very well, but as I see it, it's a very exception in Germany. So this must be fixed. And if you're talking about civic society, I think we should address more the systemic root causes of climate crisis, of human rights violations. And this has already been said, but I think this should be done a lot more. That neoliberalism is a root cause of this. This is, I think, what the youth also be quite happy about. And I think I'd give a short input or a few sentences about the youth. That is a core column of this New World Programme. I think that the youth should also be strengthened a lot more because, well, it's only in the interest of the planet if youth is strengthened, if we get funded, if we get more pedagogic help in our environments and our engagement in society, because one day we will form society, one day we will lead society. So I call for governments and I call for the NGOs to strengthen the youth, to maybe make youth councils. Some of your organizations already have those, but also give power to youth more. We're still lacking a lot of power. Also, international platform of Germany, where we're simply underrepresented still. This will help us. Yes, and also I think we should go beyond the SDGs more. Well, because economic growth isn't good for all the countries in the global north. It can't help fixing all these problems and also address systemic racism a lot more.
Thank you very much, Martin. So I think we should go on directly to Oyigoga Onu.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon.
We can hear you.
Good afternoon. I'm calling from Nigeria. Good day to everyone. I would like to think out of the box for a moment and pose some questions, though not directed at anybody, but just for us to have a reflection. And it's about my experience here in the country, where I noticed that the government have paid very weak attention to educational funding as regards equipping the basic education system with adequate infrastructure and support for the welfare of teachers in delivering their assignments in the classrooms. And this has been a repeated cycle most times. You see, strikes, unending strikes by our government institutions. And they don't pay listening ears. So, and most of the times they receive funding from international organizations. And such fundings do not go down to the table where it should be implemented. So I don't know if education is a right, and that right has been, somebody has been denied that right. I think it should be, don't we think it should be classified as a crime or a criminal offense? More so like maybe violence, bombing, terrorism that people do suffer in certain countries. and the international communities do frown at them. So I don't know if education is a right. Don't we think if someone is denied that right, such a person or an organization needs to be called to question? And if they are called to question, what arrangements, what measures could be implemented to kind of encourage such defaulting organizations to do the right thing? I understand with what Natalya said earlier, that civil society organizations need to collaborate with such governments to kind of encourage them. But most of the times, they only pay listening ears, and they don't go behind the scene, they don't do it. So since we are talking about global partnerships for the SDGs, I think it's high time we classify denial to education as a crime, and that needs some certain measurable sanctions, to be put in place. So that those countries could know that it's a big problem, because it's a global problem, and what affects a nation in one part of the world, of course, have return effects in another part. So this is the kind of perspectives I would want all of us to be reflecting upon as we come out from this UNESCO World Conference on ESD. I think I'll stop here for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much of reminding us on the one hand of the fact of corruption and money not reaching really those who it is meant for, and also the role of language, and that we need really a very clear language to address the problems that we are facing. For instance, like you mentioned, the denial of the right of education to be called a crime. And then again, the aspects of the role of CSOs between collaboration where it's possible, resistance, the role of watchdogs, and the role of advocacy and policy that we are contributing to. And I would always like to ask my two panelists if you want to react to the debate, whether you could also give me a sign, raise a hand or something like that. And we have another comment or a couple of comments and questions in the chat, I think. So we could go to that and then get back to the two of you.
Yes, actually, there's a lot of questions, 3 questions or contributions in the chat. First of all, we have Munoz, who speaks of the need to localize education, of the need, so she underlines the need to not focus only on the increase in the number of educational institutes, but also in the quality of education, and to ensure monitoring mechanisms, and then also to look more for regional cooperations and the promotion of educations among the different nations in different regions. Then we have a comment by Jacob, who stresses that governance of education, so strategy, is an important key to handle education, and has the questions how we as CSOs can actually work together to tackle that need and to promote a more worldwide governance strategy. And then last but not least, we have Dorothy, who points out that in a lot of countries in the global south, which don't have, where schools don't have access to water and sanitation, especially girls are affected because they cannot go to school when they are on their periods, and ask the question if there's something planned to handle that and supporting especially girls' education as one of the most vulnerable groups in this regard.
Thank you, Lara. So I would directly give the word to, in this case, I think, Natalya, you want to react?
Yes, I think I would like to react to the first comment from Munoz about localizing education, or the idea of a localization of education, which is one of the pillars within the roadmap as well of ESD for 2030, but it's the idea, what do we mean by the localization, and in what ways we can see collaboration between government and civil society. I think localizing ESD is not about geography, it's about inclusion, I think, and that's where the collaborative space can begin between government and civil society. I think it's about where we can find ways to provide access to quality education for all, including our marginalized groups of individuals within communities and societies as well. And civil society has a good, powerful role to play there in offering support in that. And that's where I find that there's a space for collaboration there. So we also need to we reassess the way we build capacity for providing education. And there's also a space for collaboration there between governments and civil society. So how do we partner for building capacity for education, quality education, and ESD in particular, since this is the discussion around ESD as well. So there should definitely be space for civil society to be included in the way we build capacity for educators, teachers, and trainers, and other education providers. How do we strengthen and develop resources? And that's as well an area where I see collaboration and this whole idea of providing quality education in a localized manner. So those are my kind of thoughts around the idea of localization, but also let's have in mind the idea of capacity building, which is another pillar that's important.
Thank you very much, Natalya. Werner, would you like to react to the comments and questions that we had? Like, for instance, the issue of gender justice and others?
A lot of very, very powerful comments. Thank you so much. I think I would not be able to respond to all of them, but just let me make some comments. First of all, on the global policy framework, just to recall that there is a clear roadmap for the global policy framing. And this roadmap has been stated by the international instrument, human rights international instruments. So we know that regarding education, governments and international community have 4 key obligations. One on availability of education, the second one on accessibility of education, the third one on acceptability of education, and the fourth is on adaptability of education. So we know already what government should do in terms of global policy and in terms of national policy. The problem is that the human rights framework or the SDG framework falls short compared to the human rights framework. So the SDG agenda, I mean, we are very much supportive of the SDG agenda, but we need to understand that the right to education goes beyond the SDG agenda, as Martin clearly stated, and I think that he's absolutely fine. Because we need to understand that the right to education is an universal right. It's not a problem of the southern communities. It's not a problem of the poor countries. It has to do with a universal human right, and this should be addressed from a more consistent and comprehensive understanding from the global community as well. And in order to do this, we clearly need to move education from the development agenda to the human rights agenda. Otherwise, it will be very difficult to talk about enforceability and to talk about clear obligation from state and talk about human rights. And then Ruhi came up with a very key thing on the quality of education. So we will need to start asking ourselves, what do we understand by quality education? Is it education outcomes? Is it how students perform in the education system? I don't think so. I think that quality education has to do with the pertinence of education, with the relevance of education, and what are students learning that clearly resonate with their dignity not with the market needs, not with the employer's needs. I am not saying that the economy should be disconnected to education. I am not saying this. I am saying that in addition of economy, people should learn about several different things that make life dignified for them. So it's not only about education outcomes. And let me put an example. When I visited Germany as a special rapporteur, the PISA test, the PISA crisis just passed, no? And so people were very, very much concerned about the performance of German students. But what really struck us is that the PISA really showed that the people with migrant background was left behind. So it is a matter of discrimination. It is a matter of exclusion. So this is what the quality has to do about it. Is what clearly resonates with people's needs and rights. And this has to do with education governance as well. And finally, let me see. Yeah, I mean, Dorothy addressed the gender-based discrimination and violence. And just let me recall that we cannot aspire for an inclusive education system within an exclusive society. It's absolutely ridiculous. So exclusion in education should be part of the public policy of states and should be addressed together with several other areas such as health, labor, economic rights, etc. So we should not expect that education solve the problems that the politicians do not want to solve. It's a kind of unfair having this expectation from the education side. And I have a question to you guys also. How do you see UNESCO's role in the global governance of education? Do you think UNESCO is having a good role, a good participation? How do you see this? That's a general question for you.
That's a good question. Maybe we can take this for a last round of questions and comments. Who is talking there?
Francis just raised his hands. I think he has a comment.
Okay, Francis, you're very welcome. The floor is yours, please.
Yeah, I'm Francis Mensah from Shama Sister City Commission, based in London. Thank you, Laura, for inviting me this time around. I was part of last 10 years program in Germany. It's unfortunate that this time around we couldn't meet face to face. But come back to the question the last speaker raised. What is the role of UNESCO towards education? In fact, for the last decade, UNESCO has helped very well in shaping education globally. For example, when I went to Ghana, I read about so many things UNESCO has done to so many implementations, so many things that UNESCO has done to Ghana Education Service, of which Ghana Education Service has taken its right shape. So to me, UNESCO has helped a lot in the last decade towards education. Yeah, that's what I can say for now.
Thank you very much, Francis. Maybe other people would like to take up this issue, like really for a last round of questions, comments, and conclusions. Please, the floor is yours.
Yes, maybe the question of Mr. Munoz, the role of UNESCO.
Mm-hmm.
I want to ask Mr. Munoz, have we an alternative to UNESCO? UNESCO is the leading organization, and if you're looking to the history of UNESCO, has changed really very, very fast during the last 20 years. And maybe this is also one of the reasons that, for example, the United States of America has left UNESCO for political reasons. And therefore, we have to strengthen and to support UNESCO, but nevertheless, to raise the voices of the civil society inside UNESCO. And we have to cooperate as much as possible with UNESCO and push them forward. We are the pushing sources of UNESCO. And as you really know, sometimes we got the request by UNESCO staff to do this or to do this, so that we can support their internal discussions. And therefore UNESCO is without any alternative for me, but nevertheless we have to push them as we have done it during the last 20 years. And UNESCO has a very important role for us.
Thank you, Mr. Gavani. Werner.
Yeah, no, I'm absolutely with you, Mr. Gavani, absolutely with you. I really think that UNESCO should be leading the global governance of education. We are very much supportive of education. I am asking this because unfortunately we see how many of the traditional roles of UNESCO have been taken over by other actors which are not very happy indeed. I mean, we don't see how the World Bank could have a very sensitive role on setting the policy agenda of education. I mean, having a bank running education is, I don't know, it's like having a butcher running a ballet company, something like that. So I am just worried about it. But yes, we should be supportive of UNESCO and we should be backing up UNESCO in all senses. I'm with you fully.
That's the reason that I have been always mentioning we have to push back all these privatization activities, including private foundations and whatever else. This is not the way that we have to go. We have to support UNESCO as much as possible and to keep their political leadership. And this political leadership has consequences, like, for example, with the United States of America. But nevertheless, UNESCO, for example, has a very clear position and we have to support these political statements.
Thank you very much. A last look into the chat for this round. Lara, please, are there any comments or questions that we should react to? And then we move over to introducing the idea of the shadow reports.
Exactly. Yeah, there's one more thought by Samia who says that UNESCO definitely contributed to strengthening understanding of education for sustainable development and to start changing the educational systems worldwide in a more holistic way. So she sees this transformative idea pretty much represented in the UNESCO process. And then there's another comment, or rather a question by Dorothy, who kind of questions this idea that we need more quality education than education infrastructure, because she says that could we even talk about quality education if there's still a lot of students somewhere who don't even have classrooms and do their classes outside. And I think that's probably a question which is hard to answer because it's kind of the chicken and the egg thing. And yeah, it shows that like situations globally are very different, and there's a lot of things we have to work on together in order to promote ESD for 2030 and education for sustainable development as a whole.
Thank you very much, Lara. And it also clearly indicates that we need to go on with our debate. And we are very glad that we have already another seminar planned. So let me thank you all at the panel, Natalya and Werner and all the others who participated. Thank you very much for this very interesting and inspiring critical round and for your reports from the UNESCO conference and also like for the critical debate on the problems that are linked with education beyond education, so to say. So the justice issue is the necessity to fight back the neoliberal approaches and politics and privatization and everything. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Stay safe. Bye-bye.
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 Thank you.